Now, my next topic is going to be questions, and I'm also going to include evidence into this as well. Now, your questions need to, like I said before, focus upon inquiry-based learning. They've got to be open questions, not questions which just answer with a yes or a no. That's too straightforward and too simple. If you're going to analyse, you have to be able to discuss all these factors and matters along the way. So, like we were talking about, we've been discussing the Crusades in my previous little slide, my film. So, if we stay on the Crusades, let's think about an inquiry-style question about the Crusades. So, if we were talking about why did people go on crusades, and why do people go to war today? That's a reflective question. Or can you explain in what ways the Crusades were similar to wars from the 20th century, like World War I or World War II, or the Gulf War or the Afghan War? Now, questions which start with how or why or explain, they're really, really good questions. And of course, remember that reflection. You've got to reflect upon modern times and medieval times. So that reflection about what's different now or what's the same now, and think about those big themes. Think about power, think about the religion, think about the money, think about the greed, all those big themes. Are they the same factors now as there were back in the medieval times? That's another really important thing to try to engage and incorporate or include in your question. So inquiry-based learning is really, really important. Now, your task sheet expects that you will include sources. Sources are really, really easy to understand. You may have been taught about sources before, you may not have been, but sources generally fit into two distinct categories: primary or secondary. A primary source is something that's taken from the time that you're learning about, from the time that you're studying. So a primary source might be a newspaper. Right? It might be a carving that's been made into wood by a crusading knight as he was travelling across to the Holy Land. It may be like a stained glass window in a church, given over to as a tribute to all those people that died on the Crusades. A secondary source is different. A secondary source is something that's been created after the event. So the Crusades happened 1,000 years ago. So if somebody wrote a book 600 years ago about the Crusades, even though that book is old, it is still a secondary source. If somebody gives you a book in class, hey, this is a book written by a professor in America last year about the Crusades, that is a secondary source. Now, sources are either reliable, very reliable, less reliable, quite reliable, or totally unreliable. You've got to make a decision on where your information comes from, and then whether it's a reliable piece of information or not. So think about who's actually written or drawn or taken or photographed this particular aspect of history. Who's done that? Are they trustworthy? Think about why they've made it. Why has somebody written about the Crusader in such a way? Right? If you read a source that says, and the knights entered into Jerusalem and they marched up the steps and they killed and slayed every single Muslim that they could set their eyes on, and then they went to say their prayers with blood running thick to their ankles. If that's been written by a Muslim historian, maybe he's got a bit of an axe to grind or an issue, he didn't like what was going on. Maybe he's biased. Maybe he's not quite so reliable. Even though he was there, he might not be reliable. So think about that. Nowadays, if somebody writes a book about an event like the Crusades, think about it. They've got 1,000 years of different people's writings to think about. So they can read books, and they can look at pictures, and they can go to the sites, and they can make a visit, and they can read more books, and they can go on the web, and they can get resources. And then they sit down with all the information in front of them and write a book which is going to be informative and, in their view, unbiased or reliable. So that's a a way to think about your primary and secondary sources, because you've got to find those sources on your own, on the internet. But remember, photos, diary entries, paintings, pictures, newspapers, all of those things are primary sources that you can use, all right? Any information, get back to me in class and we'll have a session on writing up questions which are analytical and inquiry based.